Welcome to Business and Human Rights with Rochelle. I'm your host, Rochelle, and I'm delighted to be with you again today. I had wanted this to be a weekly podcast, but I have had a lot of work travel lately, and I'm only really getting to this about monthly. So we're going to call it monthly now, and I appreciate you taking the time to join me. During the podcasts, I aim to share my experience as a nearly 3-decade practitioner at the crossroads of business and human rights. We will cover relevant news and speak with experts in the field. I can't wait. Let's get started. This is the June 6th episode. I'm very excited to be speaking today with Kim Almeida, Director of Programs at the Levi Strauss Foundation and overall amazing human. But first, let's go over the news. As I said, I've been traveling quite a bit and only managing a monthly episode for now, but I'm being very judicious about the news that makes the cut here. So here is a roundup of headlines. On June 1st, the European Parliament approved the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That would make it mandatory for large companies to check whether their suppliers are using child labor or damaging the environment. It would also require these companies to publish plans on how they will transition to a net zero economy by cutting carbon emissions. Richard Gardner, head of EU policy at World Benchmarking Alliance, said EU policymakers are recognizing that current voluntary codes of conduct are not producing the seismic shift we need to ensure sustainable corporate business practice. Large companies from across the world that sell products in the EU would have to comply with checks on suppliers, taking mitigating action when abuses are uncovered or face sanctions. EU states have joint say on a final deal, and negotiations on the draft will start later this month. The negotiations are likely to focus on the scope of the new rules and how early they will come into force. North Korea, Eritrea, and Mauritania have the highest prevalence of modern slavery in the world, according to the 2023 Global Slavery Index, published last month by Walk Free. The report noted a worsening situation globally, with 50 million people living in situations of modern slavery in 2021, an increase of 10 million in 5 years. The figure includes some 28 million people in forced labor and 22 million living in a forced marriage. The situation is worsening against a backdrop of increasing and more complex armed conflicts, widespread environmental degradation, and impacts from the coronavirus pandemic, among other factors. While forced labor is more common in low-income countries, it is deeply connected to demand from higher-income countries, the report said, noting that 2/3 of all forced labor cases are linked to global supply chains. The report said G20 countries, made up of the EU and the world's 19 top economies, are currently importing $468 billion worth of goods that are at risk of being produced with forced labor, up from $354 billion in the previous report. Electronics remain the highest value at-risk product, followed by garments, palm oil, and solar panels, in a sign of high demand for renewable energy products. The world's largest grain trader, Cargill, is facing a first-ever legal challenge in the United States over its failure to remove deforestation and human rights abuses from its soya supply chain in Brazil. Client Earth, an environmental law organization, filed the formal complaint last month, accusing Cargill of inadequate monitoring and a laggard response to the decline of the Amazon rainforest. The case was submitted under the guidelines of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and argues that Cargill's shoddy due diligence raises the risk that the meat sold in supermarkets across the world is raised on so-called dirty soy. Client Earth says this breaches the International Code on Responsible Business Conduct. Client Earth also cites reports alleging Cargill suppliers have been involved in rights violations of indigenous, Afro-Brazilian, and other forest-dependent communities. 3 Louisville, Kentucky McDonald's locations are being fined for violating child labor laws when the U.S. Department of Labor found 2 10-year-olds working the drive-through window and even operating a deep fryer, a prohibited task for employees under 16 years of age due to safety risks. The violations have resulted in more than $200,000 in fines. This was part of a larger investigation into 3 separate franchises operating 62 McDonald's restaurants across Kentucky, Indiana, Maryland, and Ohio. These companies had 305 employees under 16 years of age working too many hours, according to the report. In one of the deadliest incidents in Peru in years, 27 workers died from asphyxiation in a fire that broke out inside a Peruvian gold mine last month. In the last decade, more than 500 workers died in Peru, twice the deaths compared to neighboring Chile, according to official statistics kept by both countries. Peru is South America's largest gold producer, and the mine was a hybrid of formal mining operations and artisanal informal gold mining. The company participated with the Swiss Better Gold Association and aimed to provide sustainable gold from informal miners with improved social and environmental practices. A major mushroom producer in Washington state in the U.S. will pay a $3.4 million fine for gender discrimination and other unfair and discriminatory practices, resolving a lawsuit filed last year by the Washington Attorney General's office. Ostrom Mushroom Farm employed an average of 117 local workers prior to April 2021, and women made up 87% of its workforce. 1 year later, the company had systematically fired over 80% of the workers, mostly women, and replaced them with men under H-2A guest visas, according to the Attorney General. That represented an abuse of the H-2A program, which is only available to growers who present a shortage of domestic workers. Ostrom managers decided to replace its primarily female workforce because the managers believed female farm workers had childcare obligations or could not work late hours or on weekends, said the Attorney General. Ostrom also fired and disciplined women for failing to meet production requirements at higher rates than men, even though the women picked more on average. The company additionally retaliated against workers who spoke out, the office found. The company is no longer in operation. Now let's pivot to our conversation with Kim Almeida, Director of Programs at Levi Strauss, where she assesses the impact of program strategies on issues such as worker rights and well-being, democracy, immigrant rights, reproductive justice, and HIV/AIDS. She has also led the work on the Worker Well-Being Initiative, reaching over 200,000 workers in over 110 factories with programs focused on enhancing their health, financial literacy, and life skills. And before that, Kim and I had the privilege of working together, which was an experience I will always cherish. So thank you so much, Kim, for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, thank you, Rochelle. It's always such a joy to talk to you, and I will thank you for that wonderful introduction, but I will also say that I owe so much of my career choices and just my journey to the time I spent with you. So remember that you have shaped many women in CSR, including myself.
Oh my gosh, thank you. No, that's such an honor. So the foundation, because you're actually in the foundation side of Levi Strauss, they do so many amazing things. But I do want to focus on worker rights and well-being. I think I'm partial to it because I felt like a privileged witness at the inception, and you and I had joined an early stakeholder meeting together in Sri Lanka, and then later I was able to assist you guys with some internal reporting on it. But to dive right in on it, I think what I'm really struck by is, I know Levi Strauss as the first company to ever launch a supplier code of conduct back in 1989. Okay, that even predates me in this sector, but it was kind of known. They were the first. And I think that Levi's was also the first to pivot to this idea of this holistic focus on worker well-being. So can you share from your experience, what is it about the Levi Strauss culture that allows them to lead and innovate in this way?
That's a great question. So I think that the company is, it's 170 years old, and we're actually celebrating this year the 150th anniversary of the 501 Jeans, which just tells you what an old company it is. But I think it goes back to just the ethos and the values of Levi Strauss himself, which even in the early days, giving back and philanthropy and doing well by their people was just sort of part of the DNA, and we often say it was in the genes of the company, and it really was. And I think that has kind of continued throughout the years, and it's shown up in different ways, right? Certainly, we often point to the terms of engagement and the code of conduct for our supply chain as being one example of that, but there's many others that I can point to, over the course of the years, including, being a company that stood by desegregating factories in the South long before the Civil Rights Act, for example. Paying workers in San Francisco during the Depression, and making sure that people were kept on the payroll even though there wasn't really work, right? So I think that goes far back in the company's history. The other thing I would point to is just the family is still very much involved in the day-to-day operations of the company. It is a public company, but the family sits on the board, both of the foundation and the company's board, and cares deeply about the actions of the company. And those decisions lead to the choices in terms of who leads this company, including our CEO, and making sure that these values of, empathy, originality, integrity, and courage are really central to everything that we do. So I think that would be the first thing that I would say, is that the rich history. And secondly, I would say that there's also this commitment to putting people first in innovation. And not just being content with the status quo and constantly looking around the corner, right? So I think with TOE and where we were in the early 90s, that was, I think the standing by our principles and saying, this is the right thing to do, it got us to developing this code of conduct that then influenced, I think, the industry and the world, really, in terms of how we approach supply chains. But I think it was also recognizing the limitations of the auditing and compliance approach, right? And in Rochelle, when we went to those early conversations about worker well-being 10 years ago or 12 years ago now, it was really about thinking, okay, how could we do better, right? Like, we realized that having a checklist of health and safety requirements in factories, for example, is extremely important, but that shouldn't be what we strive for, right? Like, we want these people that are making our products to have a dignified work experience, right? So compliance should be the floor and not the ceiling of what we're trying to achieve. So I think that was the mindset that led us to say, okay, what else can we be doing? What are the mechanisms and the strategies that we could try out and test to do more than what we're currently doing? And that really, I think, was the impetus for coming up with the worker well-being focus and approach. And we've learned a lot over the last decade in terms of what that looks like.
Oh, that's incredible. I just love compliance as the floor, not the ceiling. And that vast history that Levi has of considering that its corporate responsibilities and what to do, before the Civil Rights Act, back to the Depression, that's an incredible kind of testament to the philosophy and, like you said, the ethos of the company. Mm-hmm. Well, so yeah, it's been about 15 years for worker well-being, and like you said, it's evolved. So what can you tell us about that evolution, that path that it's taken, and ultimately, what does worker well-being mean for the Levi Strauss Foundation today?
It's quite a journey, and I would say it's been a journey for the company and as well as for me personally. So I often track my own growth and development with that of worker well-being, because I feel like we've learned together. With the idea early on, when we started to think about worker well-being, was, workers have needs, right? So when you think about the women and the men making our products in factories, what are their needs, and how can we create programs that address those needs? It was the premise was that simple, right? And I remember, Rochelle, sitting down with you and Tamar and a few others in a group setting and developing the first ever worker needs assessment, right? And saying, how do we ask workers to identify their priority needs, right? So it was very much thinking about their lived experience as individuals, as parents, as community members, right? Like, what's going on in your life that is concerning you, that's keeping you up at night, and how can we as a brand and as a foundation support you in those issues, right? So that was the beginning stages of worker well-being. And across the board, we did a series of worker needs assessments in countries where we had a significant sourcing presence as a company. including Haiti, Cambodia, Vietnam, and a few other countries. And what we saw across the board there were some common themes in terms of what came up, right? It was health concerns, both in terms of health for themselves as individuals, but also for their families, right? We also saw water issues being an issue, a concern, right? Both access to water, but also quality of water, transportation, issues around gender, and just I would say health issues specific to women, right? Looking at menstrual health and hygiene concerns, family planning. And those were across the board, regardless of the country that we were looking at. So with that in mind, we went back and said, okay, what can we, what kind of programs can we develop that would address those concerns? And I should also add that financial insecurity came up loud and clear as being a concern as well. So with that in mind, we developed a series of programs that were very much, and by we I mean the foundation and its partners, a network of amazing grantees, develop programs that address those concerns and needs. So out of that moment were born programs like Her Health, right? Financial literacy programs run by organizations in Bangladesh and India that were really looking specifically at worker needs. And we ran those programs for multiple years, always under the premise that, these programs would not only help workers, but would also have there would be a win-win for factories, right? So factories, if they invested in women's health, for example, would see a return in terms of, lower attrition rates and higher retention, right? So really kind of trying to link it back to productivity. We were successful, I would say, across the board. Factories embraced these programs. In many cases, they co-funded the programs with us. So we started to realize that there was a switch in terms of how factories were thinking about this, because the foundation had invested millions of dollars in factory programs, but in many ways, as we reflected on it, it had been up to that point really factory-based charity, right? Like we were investing money, and the moment that our programming stopped, that's when programs stopped existing and nothing continued past our investment. So what we saw with Worker Well-Being was that there was this impetus for factories to actually contribute back, right, and to invest in these programs and to continue them past our investment. And that took us through like the first, I would say 5 years of Worker Well-Being, and we scaled quite rapidly in our supply chain with programs. And then we got to a point, Rochelle, where I was sort of scratching my head and saying, what are we thinking about? How are we thinking about impact here, right? Like number of people reached isn't really telling us a lot about how we're changing people's lives based on what we initially intended to do, right? Which was to improve well-being. So that made me pause, and we did some research and found an amazing academic partner in the Harvard School of Public Health and a team that's known as SHINE, but it's a Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise. And we brought this team in to say, let's actually do a status, let's understand the status of well-being in our supply chain. And I could go into like what we learned through that. It was an amazing experience, but we basically did a longitudinal study of about 13,000 workers on our supply chain to understand what the status of well-being was and what really the drivers of well-being are in the workplace. And what we learned has really kind of shifted the focus of our well-being approach in the last like 2 to 3 years. So where we are now is that, we learned from the programs, we learned from the early the early implementation, and have made some, I would say, pivots and some strategic shifts in the program to be much more focused on what we know matters most for improving well-being in the workplace. And that's kind of where we are now.
Amazing. What a journey. And, I can't help but think so much of Levi Strauss Foundation's journey, like the success, comes from the inclusiveness of the approach. Because I just remember like that early stakeholder meeting that we went to, Levi opened the doors. They were like, okay, we want competitors to come in. We want not just our foundation partners, which are like nonprofit groups that are offering these types of health services or financial literacy services, bring them, but also bring other types of practitioners. Like, I went in as a consultant that worked on human rights and supply chains. So they were so inclusive, and then making learnings just public, sharing it with competitors in the hopes that it would kind of drive things forward and create a better process. They don't make a narrow table, right? It's an expansive table, and kind of everyone come in, and also I think maybe bringing in Harvard is part of that. It's like, well, what's the best way to learn? This is really just about what's the best way to deliver the best thing to these people, because that's ultimately the goal. And that, again, seems to me to go back to kind of the whole ethos of the company. The way that these things are approached is so meaningful.
Yeah, and just maybe to react to that, I mean, I think there's this, the North Star in terms of what all of us ultimately want is the same thing, right? Like, we want the people making our products and our supply chains, whether it's apparel, whether it's, anything that's being produced in factories and manufacturing spaces. We want them to have a positive work experience and to leave that job in a better place than where they started, right? Like, I think that's the North Star. And I think sometimes in the collaborative spaces, we can lose track of that because it's so much about like the strategies and the tactics. And if we can focus back on why we're doing this, I think there is a lot of alignment already, right? Like, we are all moving in the same direction, and understanding that there will be different pathways, right? Every brand will probably take a slightly different pathway, but there is this common understanding of where we're moving towards. And I think the other thing that we realize at the foundation is that there's no way that we can do this alone, right? Like, tackling these big issues, like, addressing worker well-being, is not something that Levi Strauss could ever do alone. So we need to figure out how to collaborate, and we also need to be able to share what we learn and make it available to everyone else to learn from. Because what we don't want is for all of us to be, investing in the same type of research. And, what if we have the research and it can serve others and it can inform other people's pathways, like, by all means, let's share it and make it available. So that's very much, I think, the spirit that we take to all of the work in the foundation is, we know these are common challenges to all of us, right? We also know that the solutions that work should be shared because we can all benefit from it. So that very much remains central to the approach that we take.
I love it. That's so valuable for everyone else, and I certainly have gone back to those tools for a number of times over the years to really see how else they can be applied in supply chains. So I've also benefited from all that work. I'd really love to hear a memorable or meaningful moment from your work on worker well-being. I know that you've gone all over the world to work on these projects and try to identify the impacts of it. Can you share some particular moment?
Well, yeah, there's many, but I think some of the moments that really stand out to me are the moments where I've grown and expanded my understanding of what worker well-being actually means in its purest form. And I'm thinking, we've invested heavily, and this was this wake-up moment for me when I was in a factory in Mexico, probably about five or 6 years ago. And this was a factory that had taken had really taken worker well-being seriously and had done a needs assessment and determined the priority needs of the worker community, and had implemented and had begun to implement a series of programs to address worker needs, right? It was everything from health, and, obesity had been an issue that came up, and workers identified that they wanted to lose weight and get healthier. So they had brought in a third party to help them with, guiding workers to make healthier food choices for themselves and their families. They also had developed this training program to bring opportunities for growth and development to workers. So looking at line workers and developing pathways for them to become supervisors, for example. And they were running all of these programs, and they were just extremely proud of them. And I along with them was very excited and proud. And then I did something that I think, Rochelle, I probably learned from my days with you, which was, I had to go to the bathroom, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna find a bathroom and take a little break here. And of course, management in the factory was like, come with us, we're gonna take you to the manager's bathroom. And I was like, you know what? No, don't worry about it. I'm just gonna use the bathroom on the floor here, right? I'll find a women's restroom, I'll go in, it'll be quick. And I remember walking into the women's restroom, and I was immediately struck by, one, how dirty it was, right? And I mean, no surprise, we've seen many dirty bathrooms in our days, right, in factories.
Yep. Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, it's not clean. And then secondly, I went into a stall, and I was like, oh, there's no toilet paper here. Like, this is what's up. Like, I need toilet paper. And I walked out, and there was a line of women, and I was like, why isn't there toilet paper? Like, doesn't this bother you? And there's also no soap, right? Like, I'm like, there's no soap, there's no toilet paper. What's going on here? And the workers are like, oh, we don't have toilet paper in the stalls because management claims that we steal it. So we have to ask our supervisors for toilet paper. And I was like, what is going on here? So I went out and I talked to management, and I just had this moment of realization that we can do all these programs, but if we aren't thinking about actually treating the people that work in these factories with respect and fairness and trust, everything else doesn't matter. Or it does, but it matters a lot less, right? So I think about, like, really, I guess that experience really solidified my understanding of, the programs are wonderful, but they should be the cherry on top, right? Like, what we're really aiming for here is a culture of, fairness and respect and work in factories, right? And that is my North Star now, is saying, how do we create dignified work experiences? And it's about creating systems and places where workers have a voice, where they feel like they're represented, they're listened to, they're part of solutions, and where they're treated, again, with fairness, right? Like, no one wants to ask a supervisor for toilet paper, right? Like, I don't want to do that at my job. And why would a worker want to do that, right? So I think it's, in many ways, it's kind of like peeling back to the basics and saying, how do we as brands support factories to create that plumbing, if you will, and really the HR policies, but the culture where people feel like they're valued as an individual and as a human, right? And that stuff is really what matters more than all the other things that you can be doing. If you don't get the basics right, the other stuff doesn't really matter as much.
What an insightful experience. Yeah, I love all the learnings from that you just shared. Just the focus on fairness, on respect, on a dignified work experience. I always had to laugh to hear you share that about the toilets. I mean, obviously it's Latin America, right? You said that was Mexico, and so toilet paper is culturally used, and that because
Yep.
you're from Guatemala, right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
that was not something that you expected to see in a factory that was taking so much ownership over initiatives. I love how it helped you kind of see the root challenge for the factory. Because actually that kind of toilet paper issue, that's something I think we were used to seeing in the 90s. Like, it's really old. It's not that hard, to solve by taking those enormous industrial rolls and you stick them, outside the stalls on the wall, and everybody comes in and you take the amount that you need and you go into the stall. Like, it's not that hard to fix it in a way that preserves maybe the concern over supplies, but also respects the dignity for the workers. So why weren't they, making the effort to bridge that gap,
And I think those are the types of things where if you have functioning like worker groups, like, they can be part of the identification of solutions, right? Like, if you talk to workers, they'll probably tell you, actually, here's some solutions that might work, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
listening to them, right? And asking them, how would you do this, right? Like if if you were to set up a system that worked better than this one, what would it look like, right? Um, and the factories that get that right, I think those are the ones that are actually constantly kind of adapting and learning and innovating in ways that really do drive improvements to well-being, right? Because it's not like a one and done deal, right? It's about constantly having having like a two-way communication channel where you're hearing from workers, and they're also identifying challenges before they become big, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if a I mean we've all seen it, right? Like if a water cooler isn't or a water cooler and a drinking fountain isn't working in a factory, like if workers can identify that early and feel comfortable just going up to HR, whoever's on the floor and saying, "Hey, this isn't working," it can get fixed quickly, right? But oftentimes it just sits there. No one identifies it. No one says anything. And then it becomes something that people complain about, right? So I think it's just about really creating those pathways for better communication in factories. And I know that I'm making that sound simple. It's hard, right? Like it's not like this is easy work, but I think that's where the real benefits lie, right? And that's when, coming back to the evidence of what we've seen with Harvard, is that those are the moments where you actually see workers have autonomy and feel better about their work experiences, and that drives improvements in well-being scores, right? When you look at like the composition of how we identify or how we define worker well-being, which at this point we're using kind of the definition that we're borrowing from Harvard, which is, well-being is a state of health, satisfaction, and engagement, right? So you need all of that. You need to feel healthy. You need to feel satisfied, and you need to feel engaged at work. And if you only focus on one of those, that's great, but it's not all of well-being together, right? Like it's not the full package. And I think about like even my own work experience, right? Like it's not that different. You need to feel like you have a supervisor that respects you, that trusts you, that believes in you. You need to be surrounded by peers that also you enjoy working with. You need to have a healthy work environment, right? Like it's all of that matters for well-being.
That is wonderful. And for listeners that want to know more about the outcomes of the Harvard studies and the current state of the foundation's work, I assume that's all online?
Yes. So we have on the Worker Well-Being site on levi.com, we have a summary report of the research that we've done with Harvard, which, it's warts and all, right? Like this is not easy stuff. There's a lot there that isn't pretty, but it's very much helpful in terms of directionally guiding us in the right, I guess, in the right pathway forward. So that report is available for anyone that wants to download it. And then we also have, I would say, a worker well-being guidebook, which takes the Harvard research and really we spent about a year really thinking about, okay, based on this research, how can we action this, right? What's the pathway forward? And what we've developed is a guidebook for our suppliers that really sets out the pathways for achieving well-being and for driving improvements in well-being, focused on like the key areas that we know matter most. And all of that is available on the website.
Great, great. I'm definitely going to check that out. And so now you've been at Levi Strauss Foundation for over a decade. So congratulations on your
Thank
your
you.
anniversary.
Thank you.
What keeps you going and doing this work?
Well, there's a lot to do. I think first and foremost, any of us that work in human rights and worker issues and supply chains know that the work is to be continued, and there's a lot more to do. So I think that's my main motivation, is that I see progress, but there's also a lot left to do, and I want to be really humble in saying that Levi's is on the road, but by all means, there's a lot to be done, and I always I always enjoy conversations and partnerships with folks that are equally committed to this, because I do think there's a lot we can learn from each other. So um, I think that's what keeps me here first and foremost. I also really love the space that the Levi Strauss Foundation sits in, right? So I think what's really unique about being in a corporate foundation that has been around as long as the Levi Strauss Foundation, which is over 70 years old as a corporate foundation, is that we've figured out how to work really effectively with the company. And especially, I'm speaking specifically about labor rights and worker well-being. It's really a unique space to be in, where you can think kind of outside of the box, and you can work with partners and fund ideas that are innovative, that are new, that are risky. And then you have access to a supply chain that is, and a company that is really willing to partner with you and try things out, right? So I think it's this, I often think of it as being like a social innovation lab, right? Where you can take really good ideas and put them into action in a company's supply chain in small ways that if I sat within a sustainability team, I wouldn't necessarily have the bandwidth to be able to do, right? Because you do have limitations on how you use your budgets. So I think that's one of the probably the singular, like probably the most important reason why I'm here, is that I think there's this really unique setup that has just, given me permission to dream, to think outside the box. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Rochelle, to also fail, right? Like sometimes I haven't been successful in everything I've done, and we've done to, we've tried things that certainly were not always things that we decided to scale, or approaches that we scale. But that ability to be able to dream is really, really valuable. So I think that's been another reason. And I would just also add that I've had amazing managers and leaders that I've worked with, and that's so important for my decision to continue staying in this role and growing within the organization, because it's just been amazing to be surrounded by people that believe in me and trust me, and also give me permission to dream, to expand, and to grow. So all of those, I think it's a combination of all of those reasons that have made the Levi Strauss Foundation really feel like home for me.
I love it. I love it. They're lucky to have you. So finally, do you have any advice for people who are looking to pivot more to the S in ESG, or just enter the field overall?
Well, I think, Rochelle, going back to even my early days with you, I think that for anyone interested in this in this space, it's just starting out as a consultant or an auditor is such a valuable it's such a valuable place to start with, because you gain experiences and insights, and that will be invaluable regardless of where you go in the space. And it also just gives you a sense of the breadth and differences between approaches, between companies, and also how sort of international players fit into this mix. So I guess I'm giving the advice that I was given and that I took when I was young, which is start as a consultant and get to know the breadth in the field before you make a decision about where you want to be, right, in terms of brands. I also, and I love it when folks are interested on the social side of ESG and just supply chains, because ultimately I think supply chains are made up of people, right? Like it almost feels to me like it's the natural place to start, right? Supply chains, even the word is to me, it's kind of misleading, because it really is about it's about people at the end of the day, and everything else in ESG depends on people, right? Like if you get this the S part right, I honestly think it enables all of the other pieces to fall into place, right? Like when we talk about environmental issues and climate adaptation and resiliency, all of that stems from it you have to center people, And if you, again, have an empowered workforce that's part of the solutions, you're much more likely to be successful in those other spaces, right? So to me, I think centering people makes complete sense, or at least that's how I think about it in my mind. And I actually think as a field, we would be more successful if we were able to really bring the human element and the S piece into every conversation, and not see them as sort of siloed and separate, but really that integration, I think would be valuable. And I see it happening more and more, but I do think that we still have a ways to go in terms of really fully integrating all of the elements of sustainability, and not seeing them as like separate silos, but rather fully intersectional.
So well said, Kim. I couldn't agree more. I think that's right on target. And I've just enjoyed this conversation so much. I've learned so much from your journey and where you're going now, and I'm excited to hear more in the future.
Oh, thank you, Rochelle. It's been a joy to speak to you.
That's a wrap on our conversation with Kim Almeida from the Levi Strauss Foundation. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe so you can catch me every week, and check out my feed on Instagram and TikTok for more content. Until next time, have a great week.